It is on. Hello. 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 It is definitely working. So that's good. Okay, as we all trickle in, thank you for being here. And as we recall, we've been the last week or so, we've been looking at a lot of these changes that happened, were beginning to happen in the 50s and in the 60s, things that were challenging the way that that our fellowship understood and looked at things. And so some have, labeled that progressive things. And so, remember, anytime you got labels, you got to kind of define them, and they're still going to mean different things to different people. But just so we kind of understand where we're at and so on and so forth. And so we were looking at these changes and the questioning of things. And some of this questioning was brought on because of the events that were happening. What was the Civil Rights Movement, what was the Vietnam War, were things that were causing very tumultuous times, and the reactions to those. It was helping to bring those things about. But there was also changes in what you might call scholarship and in looking at things. And there's always been that. But again, we were having those things. And so questioning a lot of things that had been understood and so on and so forth. And so for some, that was a breath of fresh air. For others, it was great angst and caused great confusion. And so as a result of that, whenever there's kind of change, there's always the pushback. And so today we're gonna look at what has been called that conservative response to things. And so in many of the progressives of the 1960s, if many stood in the apocalyptic and ethical heritage of Barton Stone, in other words, they were looking at these greater things and what's important. There can be no doubt that the conservative wing, as we called it, that emerged among churches of Christ in the 60s belonged to the tradition of the radicalized Christian Baptists. Now we got to go back a little bit. Remember, the Christian Baptist was Alexander Campbell's, I don't know if it's proper to say his first publication, but he had that, and later it became the Millennial Harbinger. So just for that. And in the Christian Baptist, Campbell was basically challenging so much of the status quo in Protestant Christianity and so on. And so he could really go after it. And so that way of going after it and was kind of inbred into things, and there was many that were attracted to that. And so some took those ideas and those critiques of the way things were, and some took them and ran with them even further than probably even Campbell had intended. And so as you remember, when we use the word radicalized, we're talking about those that took those ideas and those things that he was questioning and promoting, and some took them even further. But anyhow, these conservatives stood squarely in the long train of believers going back to the youthful Alexander Campbell. As we said, Campbell kind of moderated and changed some as he got older. It wasn't quite the firebrand that he was when he was younger. Tolbert Fanning, Benjamin Franklin, Austin McGarry, and even Forty Wallace Jr., men who were deeply concerned with biblical authority, with law, rationality, and order. In other words, they had those concerns that were very prominent to them, that were very important, that they focused on. And thus, we cannot properly say that this wing of the Churches of Christ emerged in the 60s, for it had been there all along. Rather, they came to prominence. In other words, those that thought like this were always there, but then they started having pushback. And so as you're, that's why. I know, or, get it in the right direction or whatever. But Various factors motivated them to intensify their message and become especially vocal and extraordinarily visible. The relativistic side of the 1960s challenged their concern for law and authority. The existential dimension of the 60s challenged their passion for Lockean and Baconian rationality and the fact that American culture in that period stood in such disarray challenged their concerns for neatness. All right, that paragraph said a lot. Okay, so let's talk about what's being said there. Okay, relativism. Okay, remember, and again, it's probably wrong to say prior to the 60s because it was there, but it really flourished in the 60s. But relativism was this counter to this idea of absolute truth. And so from the Enlightenment, there was this idea that there's absolute truth and you can understand things absolutely. Okay, and that was a very dominant theme for a couple hundred years. And so what started happening was when you got certainly into the 20th century, you see the world go through 2 world wars, and especially over in Europe, you see everything you know get blown up, or much of it. It kind of changes what your assumptions are and how you think about things. And so this idea of relativism is that maybe there isn't at least as much absolute truth as one thought. And so just challenging all these things. And so from this, we eventually developed into, you've heard, well, there's your truth and there's my truth. Your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth, instead of what is truth. And so in the 60s, actually starting in the 50s, but in the 60s, this blossomed. And so for those that lived and were, again, I was a little kid, I should say conscious of what was going on, there was tremendous upheaval. You see as you read these things, well, and then the Beatles came. Well, what did the Beatles do? They brought more of the music. They kind of enhanced these things and challenged. And so we see much of, as far as in religion, we see much of what they call Eastern thinking coming to the United States and in the areas. And so there was so much challenge and upheaval. And then you saw the responses in the social sphere and the riots and the this and the that, and then later against the war and so on. And so tremendous upheaval going on in these different thinking. And some would say similar probably to today in these challenges. And so what did, maybe as you watched your TV, I remember as a kid, I'm saying, what are they all rioting for? Why is there all these clashes with the police we see on the nightly news? What was all this that was going on? And so much of that. And so many viewed that as a challenge to authority, to the law, and so on and so forth. And again, very, very complicated. So the existential dimension of the 60s, and we're going to talk about existentialism just for a moment, challenged this long-held John Lockean, Francis Bacon, scientific method, these ways that we can know things for sure, this rational thought, and there's truth, and then what is right, what is not, this more simple, supposedly exacting way of looking at things is getting challenged. And so our fellowship was one that was deeply rooted, as we've talked about, in this way of thinking, and as we looked at the scriptures. And so we see, again, our culture in disarray and upheaval. So what is existentialism? We've probably heard that. Maybe some have looked at it and studied it. But this is very simple, or simplistic, what I'm saying here. It can get really complicated and messy. But existentialism is a family or group of philosophical views, ways of looking at things, that study our existence, why am I here, from an individual's perspective. Instead of this collective idea or this broader humanity, It's what do I think? How does it affect me? Okay? And explore the human struggle to lead an authentic life. Those are some terms that we even hear thrown around today. What does it mean to lead an authentic life? Well, it used to be things were looked at more from that biological and exterior and things such as that. But then around, in the Enlightenment also, you had those that were saying that these things should be defined by what we think and hear. And that's why we have today, it's developed into that confusion that we see of who's a man and who's a woman. In other words, instead of, in the minds of some, this being defined as, well, you're defined at birth, and we see that in the language of laws they're trying to write and things such as that. Okay, and we understand that biological definition. Well, there's others that say, no, it's who I am and what I think in my mind is who makes me who I am. And so and again, this seems very confusing, and I don't disagree, but nonetheless, so this is some of that has its roots in this type of thinking. And so what does it mean to lead an authentic life? Me as an individual here, this speck on the planet, when so much of life seems absurd or incomprehensible in the universe. And you are those that promoted that kind of thinking. And it brought about certain results that many of us would deem as not good or effective. In examining meaning, purpose, and value, the existential thought often includes concepts, and we've heard this before, existential crisis, something that so upends one's thinking or place or whatever, it creates a lot of problems. Angst, courage, and freedom. And so we may be more confused than when I started reading this. I understand that. But nonetheless, I think the basic thing is this idea of existentialism goes really down to this kind of severe individualistic outlook. Now, those of us that have, studied our scriptures, we realize that there's things in the scriptures that say we're to die to ourselves. We're to put that self, to live for Christ, live for others, so on and so forth. And so it would very much challenge this way of thinking. But yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. In other words, you don't. Your relationship with God isn't based on osmosis. It isn't because who you're next to, or even because you necessarily think a certain way on this issue or that issue, but rather it's. And so you're right. And you know what? As I've read through and really tried to look at a lot of these things, so many of these things that maybe some might view go way off track and get really nutty. That there's still some foundation to some of the points that they're making, and so just to put that in also. But anyhow, so this is part of what's driving all this upheaval and all this change, and so in our own lives, what happens when we're having those kind of situations? What do we tend to do, Bill? Okay.
1960, I was 13 years old. They were taking me there. They weren't even trusting me behind the wheel yet, which I considered to be a sin. Well, that's the reason I was in Missouri and you were in Arkansas. I didn't want any big close.
Mm-hmm.
families in Christ, kids that I had grown up with
Yeah.
in the church, that became part of a turmoil, a strife in adult thinking, and any of these big words you want to throw out there, existentialism or whatever it might
Mm-hmm.
be. And one thing we're not covering, I don't think in this last, probably that seldom is, what effect does all this have on the children in our church?
We're going to talk about that
Up
some.
until about 1950 something, late 50s,
Yeah.
the Church of Christ was the fastest per capita,
Yeah.
was the fastest growing church in the United States of America. And by the time we got to the 70s, it was way below the top 10.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that affected Sherry and I even until 1980, over a whole, you call it 2 decades or a whole generation.
Generation. Mm-hmm.
In the mid-80s, mid-90s, we were down at Camp Neotes and experiencing the youth of our families in Christ being one and being friends
Mm-hmm.
and worshiping down there for those that did worship, whether it was around a campfire or whether it was in Bible class or whatever function was taking place. These children were one. But then within the next 10 years, looking into the mid to late 90s, we saw children that had gone to church, to church camp, Camp Neotes,
Yeah.
for a period of 6, 7 years. Become deeply involved in each other and waiting each year for the moments when they'd be able to get together at either one of Steve Autry's rallies, monthly meetings,
Yeah.
or Camp Neotes or other functions like that, because that was their chance to get back together again and feel the stability in Christ in their youth. These children were being ripped apart
Yeah.
because of different philosophies
Yeah.
and different individuals. And in other words, they realized that they were no longer acceptable if they stood and they clapped during a song in Camp Neotes campfire.
Mm-hmm.
So a certain group of these kids would separate themselves from these other kids because they weren't acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't the way mom and dad wants me to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I saw that just rip the hearts out of those kids. Thusly, we ended up being a servant of the evil one instead of Christ. And it made us, Sherry and I, both sick to heart
Sure.
to see that happen. And finally, there was another entire church camp developed down near Rolla, Missouri. And now the name has just flown out of me, but that's where all of the quote-unquote conservative children go to the church camp now. And those that aren't that conservative would go to Camp Neotes. And Sherry and I fought that for
Yeah.
about 5 or 6 years, trying to get these congregations to
Uh-huh.
not use their kids as ploys,
Sure.
but let these kids be together. Let them grow up as one in Christ. But it still hasn't happened today.
So as Bill's sharing from
I'm sorry.
that's okay, you're good. Personal experience, if you will, just an example of how things here were tearing things up, but that it did later. These generational things, and so he brings up at camp, and there's congregations around that do not support Neotes, as we well know. And it can be, for different reasons. For some, it was like, uh-oh, they're clapping. Or at least in the example you're sharing. Or it could be other things. Or there's a congregation that goes there to support the food pantry. And so there are those that would say, and as you're saying, is it why? Why are those things that are... and so there were those that were asking those questions. And then there were those that said, who believed that, hey, I've got to follow the scriptures exactly right, whatever that means. That's a very subjective term. And that someone's right here might not be the right understanding over here, and so on and so forth. And so rather than, hey, we're following Jesus Christ, it got equated with all these other things. And there's those that feel very strongly and very sincerely that way, even today. It's not a question of sincerity, okay? And so that's why, it's important that we look at and try to understand these things as to why. Now here, part of that motivation is that you're seeing all this upheaval going on in your culture. You see all these challenges to things that you've been told or held that this is exactly the way it should be. And so what do? You tend to dig in because we don't understand. That's just a natural response. Tend to dig in for those that are challenged by that. And so more of these conservatives lived in small towns, the way it worked, kind of more rural. It was kind of that urban city, suburban, rural kind of divide, which we've talked about. Those things are very real in whatever ways of thinking, and then lived in large cities. And on the whole, they had little acquaintance with the results of graduate-level theological scholarship. In other words, some of these changes and things were happening because there were those that were learning things that were making sense as they looked at the scripture and so on. And so, but as Joe has pointed out before, we had no idea that these things were going on. And so every place doesn't, even though these things affect things at some point. They gave little evidence of interest in the dominant ethical issues of the period. In other words, the civil rights movement, as we've covered, we didn't cover the war very much. That's not what's important. But they did express a great deal of concern over what they called liberalism in the church. And again, that's a very broad word. And when, depending on whose company you're in, if you use those words, certain images and ideas are conjured up. Just like you call somebody a communist or things like that. You think a whole slew of things. And so thus, or even the word conservative, same goes the same way as far as that. And they sought to preserve the restoration vision that they had received from Floyd Wallace. Now by that it's meaning, remember, Wallace was a major figure in the 30s and 40s, and even 50s, as we've covered extensively. And so, often, as one famous person used to say, most people's history goes back to when they were born. And so Wallace would have been someone that they would have known or heard of and so on. So saying going back to Wallace. But, certainly before that. And so for many, the idea of what became so sacred was preserving the idea that we have to restore the New Testament church, however one understands that or envisions that. And so any challenge to that was gonna be pushed back on. So these conservatives tended to view the 1960s as a period of degeneracy and decay, rooted in moral relativism and the collapse of law and order and social structure. Now, me as a little kid, that's how I kind of understood it, as much as a little kid can understand those things, because that's the way my parents understood it. And when I can hear my dad yelling at the TV on the news, and maybe your parents, or maybe you did that too. I don't know. My dad was one of those guys that talk in the mirror to himself and had those kind of arguments. But anyhow, and so the view is you're looking for reasons. Why is this happening? And no doubt some of that is so. I mean, it's not that that's bunk or something. It's so. Johnny Ramsey attributed American degeneracy to the breakdown of respect for authority. In the face of this onslaught, he looked at churches of Christ with their back to the Bible plea for real solutions to the nation's problems. The absolute nature of truth, he maintained, will take care of the new morality with its everything is relative approach. In other words, we've gotten away from this idea of understanding that there is absolute truth, God is absolute truth, the Bible is truth. We need to get back to that. And we're not unfamiliar with these pleas because we've understood them, believed them, practiced them, so on and so forth in our experiences. So this is what's going on. This is that response. Not saying that's not a good response, but that's a response. Another conservative, William Reeves, ascribed our modern peace cults, love cults, nonviolent cults. Remember all the free love of the 60s and all this, that's part of the thinking that's going on here. That these things came directly from modernism and liberalism. Okay, this way of thinking that we've chronicled from the late 19th century into the 20th and looked at that extensively. Liberals, he complained, want a God who is only good. And Protestantism is one large grace cult, rejecting the truth about works of obedience, such as baptism. The God of the Bible, however, was rigorous and demanding and certainly not a candidate for membership in some peace cult. And so this William Reeves' response is blending his theology with the events that are going on in the world today of trying to understand that certainly in his own mind. We see in this, and we've heard some of these phrases, oh, you're trying to be gooder than God. You ever heard that phrase? You never heard that phrase? In other words, hey, you're putting too much, you're saying you don't have to do anything. I remember one man I was close to said about another congregation, not of our fellowship, that was getting very large. He would said, there's no rules there. There's no rules. You can just do whatever and be whatever, and that's good enough because grace covers that. And then of course we know the baptism arguments and things like that, and the counter ones, and so that's all involved in this. I don't know. This was our author got this out of somebody commenting or writing an article in one of the various publications, and so he's just bringing this up as an example of the topic that we're on, but this idea that God of the Bible was rigorous and demanding, and what you do, and so on and so forth, and so we're seeing this a little bit of a different thing. And so people are going to bring in what they understand in their lenses to helping them make sense of what goes on just as we are today. Reeves went on to argue that the problem facing America called for rigorous and demanding responses. Civil rulers are to use the sword whenever necessary, Romans 13:4. Please note that the sword is an instrument of death. The Christian is to support all of this, Romans 13:6. God wants evil suppressed on every level, local, national, and international. Okay, so this is the idea of God wants law and order. Okay, and we've heard that. And so on. Here is it, yes, Bill.
And there is a reason that I don't know if I would want to.
Yeah, here's the reason.
Yeah, there's reasons and scriptural reasons
Yeah.
that are well founded for
Correct. Correct.
but we've got to remember the new covenant under Christ and the way he lives and the way he will walk.
Sure.
My situation with this is that I interrupted your thought. I'm sorry.
You're okay.
My thought is that I'm reading, throughout the Bible again, in Deuteronomy, for example.
Mm-hmm.
God follows this code that
Mm-hmm.
was initially mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
If you were worshiping another God, a visitor to the children of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
and you didn't convert, or
Mm-hmm.
you were to be stoned.
Mm-hmm.
Stoned, and then after those three burst through their stones, the entire family in that city or whatever it was, were to go ahead and stone this individual as well to death. So God had a real harsh life.
Yeah, and that's how those things have been understood.
How far do we go with that today?
Yeah, but when you start digging into it, it seems to get a little more complicated. Yes, Joe. Okay. Okay. Hmm. Okay, so Joe is saying that instructor at Harding used to say that the Old Testament was how God would like us to live. We saw it didn't work out, so He sent Jesus, so that grace and mercy and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, that's certainly some understandings. There have been those that have challenged our understanding of some of those things, and the idea this seems to be against the nature of God. These, yeah. Uh-huh.
He said that that's the way it was with God, but Jesus took the stone out of our hands.
Hmm.
That was Ralph. But when you consider that God developed the plan for Jesus before man ever fell off
Yeah.
of the ladder, God had in mind originally that He was going to have plans for all of us to get to heaven.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Restrictions, things like that. Yeah. If you follow them. Sure, and that's certainly a credible understanding of those things. But again, there's those that have kind of looked at it, and so as we look at this, we're not unfamiliar with this passage that's talking about follow the authorities, do what they say, God put them in place, and so on and so forth. What do you do if there's the unjust king? What did our forefathers reason out of this? What do you do if Bonhoeffer was living in Germany under Nazis and everything, and he's held up, and we're not unfamiliar with who Dietrich Bonhoeffer was, and stuff. And what did he do? He determined Hitler needed to die and kill the authority because of the great evil that was in there. Well, what about this? My only point is look, it can get complicated. And so if one is on the side of wanting to do with those folks that are causing all the upheaval and getting on them, we're like, yeah. But what if we're thinking, hey, wait a minute, this is a valid point we're concerned about. And so now that should be turned. And I'm just saying it can get messy. and it isn't as clean cut as we think, and it's easy to think certain things when we're on that side of that. Whereas, just the point, and I know that sounds very relative, and it kind of is, but I think, sometimes things are broader. But anyhow, we're just looking at the understanding and the reasoning of what's going on. Now, Rubel Shelley, who many of us know that name, was a man who began his career in the more conservative fold, but underwent conversion to a more grace-oriented perspective between 75 and 80. And right around early 80s, he wrote a very famous book in our fellowship. It was called I Just Want to Be a Christian. And part of it was challenging so many of these other things. I just want to be a Christian. Instead of, I have to think right on this, and this, and that, and according to somebody, to be right, or to be in fellowship, or so on and so forth. But anyhow, and that was a very influential book. And he argued in 1972, this is before that happened, the anti-authoritarian philosophy of existentialism denies all absolutes. And I think we've kind of touched on that. He asserted, and under its influence, men defy the authority of Christ and the Bible in religious matters. And citizens defy the civil authority which God has delegated to policemen, mayors, governors, and other officials by obeying only those laws which they like and disobeying the rest. So he's making the case for using, the authorities to quash the upheaval and all that's going on. So just looking at the perspectives. Mainstream churches of Christ shared these convictions. In other words, we thought, I understand that. I thought, to a significant degree, but there was a decisive difference between what we call the mainstream churches and this conservative wing that became very prominent. First, mainstream churches of Christ were increasingly urbanized. In other words, the big congregations were in the cities or in the suburbs and so on and so forth. And we've already documented greatly that the perspectives on things can be very different due to those experiences. And we're flirting with evangelical understandings. In other words, this idea of grace instead of the more legal type look at things. And it undergone significant acculturation. In other words, we said that we accepted many of the things that were going on in our culture and even equated them with Christianity, as we've covered. And many had been open to the implications of higher education. And so even though they kind of were concerned about the same issues, they were coming at it for some very different approaches. Now, with few exceptions, the new conservatives had resisted all these changes in their efforts to maintain the 19th century rational and authoritarian vision as pure as possible. In other words, when Campbell and others said, we have restored the church, and they made that claim, okay, and we've talked about that extensively, that is what we're holding on to. That is that's been accomplished. It's been finished. And so any deviation from that is breaking out from that. And so we've got to fight to maintain that. And if you're going in a different direction, you're one of those liberals. You're one of those folks like that. And so that's the argument that's going on. Yes, Joe. Mm-hmm. Sure. Uh-huh. Well, let's discuss that question for a moment. Okay? You just now said an individual who has studied and honestly and all that, studied the scriptures and have come to certain conclusions, that somehow that's different than what man decides. Well, they are a man or a woman, first of all. Sure, I understand that, and many make that claim.
Studied the Bible extensively.
Hmm.
My dad was a very smart man.
Sure.
He did not have a college degree,
Uh-huh.
but he was a very smart man.
Mm-hmm.
He was very well looked upon in the community.
Sure.
And you act like that. People in rural areas didn't have, access to colleges. We had Crowley's Bridge College,
Sure.
which is a Christian college.
Mm-hmm.
We had Arkansas State,
Hmm.
which was a very, at that time, Christian oriented.
Okay.
And so, I don't, well, I don't know what the point is. I just know what I did and how I was raised. And and more influence.
Yeah.
Not like that, not that, I know.
Sure.
And that's what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Go ahead.
And I was just listening, and I was thinking to myself, conservative, Republican family, I'm a Republican. But my neighbor was raised by a more liberal Democratic family, very Democratic. And my thought was this: I studied the Bible, and I've come up with what I believe is the pattern that I should follow to walk in the light.
Mm-hmm.
You follow the pattern through study, and you establish the pattern as to where you think you need to walk. And the whole time, the Holy Spirit is pulling his hair out. He said, no, this is the pathway I'm trying to get to.
Yeah.
You listen to me. That's why we have the Holy Spirit, right?
But that's also why we have Bible studies,
Yes.
so that we can determine each other's things and decide when, okay, what is it that the Bible says in the middle of all this?
And I see my conservative values, not that they're right or wrong, but my values, coming out of my mouth all the time when I'm teaching Bible classes or hearing comments from other people. And we have both sides of the coin well described and well covered in our senior Bible class, okay? But it was brought up this last Wednesday. We need to be one. And we need to love each other
Mm-hmm.
and accept each other.
This is a really big topic you brought up, Joe.
Yes.
So, just make a couple comments, because we need to probably end with this because of the time. Appreciate all the discussion. Good. Sorry I didn't have mics out so everybody could hear us intently there. But basically what Joe is expressing is, well, first of all, it isn't just Grant trying to do this. This is trying to present information so we understand what was going on. And so, at least that's and so we see this divide that's happening. Now, that doesn't mean that people in the rural areas didn't have education or weren't smart or anything like that. But as you look at these things, there's a difference in perspective. Just like we call it flyover country, and they said they call it the left coast for a reason. Okay, and we kind of understand those in political terms. But the point is, and on the East Coast and the West Coast are very different than flyover country, which is us. And so while in those issues, also in these. And so these things that affect us in these different perspectives. And as Bill pointed out, we all have things we bring to the table that influence how we're looking at and understanding things, no matter how pure and unaffected we're trying to make ourselves as we look at the scriptures. And so yes, the scriptures are, the answer and all those kind of things. That's true. And so in trying to understand these things and how it got to there, is why we're looking at this. Because that has an influence on us today as we're trying to navigate these times. I think these times now are very similar in, maybe not in exact details, but in terms of tenor or tone or things like that. And so if we're going to be effective in trying to reach out and talk and understand, that it's important to understand that. But anyhow, but bottom line, so we saw those that wanted to look to the way that Wallace, in this case, went about things, that hard fight and charger style, and went about things that way. And so anyhow, we've got to end here. We're out of time. So thank you very much, and we will continue on next week. Thanks for all the comments.